Hello, everyone. Welcome to Reignite Your Purpose Conversations with Munira. I am Munira Premji, and I am beyond delighted to welcome every one of you to the webinar today. If you have joined us over the past couple of weeks, you would have participated in two workshops. The first one was on self-awareness, where we did a lot of work around values. And the second workshop was on perception and how you see the world. And our hope is that you're taking some dedicated time to practice some of the skills that we are covering in the workshops. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, welcome. You will find past sessions on this series at iicanada.org. Our guest today is Leila Rahemtulla, the one and only Leila Rahemtulla, a brilliant educator and management consultant, and someone that I absolutely love working with. Leila teaches for Simon Fraser University and BCIT in the areas of organizational behavior, leadership, and instructor development. And in 2018, Leila received the coveted YWCA's Woman of Distinction Award for the work that she's done in education, training, and development. And today she's back with us so we can have a robust conversation about change and resilience. Leila, I know that this is a topic that we are both incredibly passionate about. So welcome to the webinar.
Thank you, Munira. Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to join another conversation with you, and welcome to all of you, and thank you for joining us.
All right, so let's talk about change. So change is this really big, mega-sized, supersized topic that we're going to try and parse for you in an hour. What do we know about change? We know that change is a constant. We know that change is a normal part of life. We know that there are some changes that we choose to make, and then there are other changes that are imposed on us, kicking and screaming. We know that changes can be positive, like getting married or buying that car that you've been eyeing or landing that dream job. And we also know that changes can be challenging, like losing a job or being diagnosed with an illness or the death of a loved one. I also find that different people have different reactions to change. Some folks tend to thrive on change and others find change a little bit more exhausting. So given that change is a constant, what we'd like to do today is share with you a couple of fabulous models. One model is a change model, so that we have some common shared language around the change process and how we typically respond to any change that comes our way, be it positive or negative. And it really is remarkable that whatever the change is, our predictable response to that change is quite similar. And that's what we would like to share with you. Now, when the change is really difficult and takes center stage, it can cause significant stress. We've all been there. And that is when we need to be resilient. And what is resilience? Resilience is the ability to bounce back after a really difficult change, a difficult setback, a difficult obstacle. And so today, what we have done is to package the two together for you, change and resilience. And we hope to provide you with strategies and tools and information that you can use the next time you are dealing with a change situation. Would you like to weigh in, Leila?
Yeah, so I'm so glad that this particular module of this particular session in the series is placed right here. Because if you think about the sort of journey of self-discovery we've all been on together, it's been knowing ourselves and knowing how we are taking in the world. But the reality of what you just said, Munira, is that the world has got a bunch of things happening on the outside. And when we pay attention to that, it can impact us, and it can impact us with stress, and it can impact us in a way when we start to look at the title of the series, which is Reignite Your Purpose. It can throw you off your game. It can kind of take you away from your purpose, because that thing that's happened to you or the change that you've experienced has kind of thrown you off, and you're now, sort of lost in this process, and it feels like maybe you're not as connected to what it is you were supposed to be doing anymore. And so I love that context. The other thing that I thought of as you were talking was the Darwin quote that says, it's not the strongest of the species that survive, nor the most intelligent, but it's the one that's most resilient. It's the most responsive to change. So I think when we start to look at self-development and building strength within individuals, we can see that our responsiveness to change, our resilience, is a way that strengthens us and lets us stay connected to our values in a much stronger way. Yes, those things are going to happen outside of us, but now we've got clarity about the process that we're going to go through, and that we haven't lost our way, that we understand how we bounce back. And so I think this is just a thoughtful module to include at this time.
Beautifully stated. And what I love about what you said is that this is a skill that we can learn. Yes, change can be overwhelming and can be so hard sometimes, and sometimes so much of it can come to us at the same time. But we can absolutely learn how to best respond to a change. And so, yeah, that's going to be the meat of today's session.
Great.
But before we get into the really heavy stuff, I thought we could start with a fun activity. And this is an activity that I'm hoping that every one of you on the webinar today will also participate in. And the activity is to jot down 10 changes that have occurred in the world in the last 10 years. And think big, think wide, right? So changes that might have occurred in the world, in the environment, or technology, or food, or how we do business, or the environment, or politics, right? So anything that you can come up with, 10 things that have changed in the world in the last 10 years. And Leila and I will do this activity with you. Okay. And feel free to post these in the chat box if you wish. I've got 3 so far.
Okay. Do you want to share them?
The first one that came to my mind right away was Spotify. I don't think that existed 10 years ago, and yet it has become a very big part of my life. Podcasts. Podcasts. I listen to about 5 or 6 a day, and I can't even believe that they didn't exist 10 years ago. I'm looking at food habits, like the keto diet, which is a real thing today. Mm-hmm. Netflix. Okay. That's where I get a lot of the my streaming service entertainment today.
So I had a few. I approached it a little differently. I did look at technology. That jumped out at me because I think technology is sort of often it represents some real rapid change. But I thought about how I work and where I work, the nature of how I deliver training. I mean, certainly now I deliver training to people all over the world without leaving my home. But also the way we're connected. I think about my family overseas and the fact that we have conversations just like this one, and that certainly wasn't happening 10 years ago. And so definitely there changes around technology. I think I also thought about the stage I'm in my life. So 10 years ago, I was in a different place. As was my family. My children were 10 years younger. They were in a different stage in their life, and so that impacted us as a family. And our families changed. we've lost a few family members in the last 10 years, and that's changed the dynamic, and the roles that we play with one another have adjusted as a result of that. So the head of the family isn't there anymore, and so now who steps into that role, and how do we kind of adjust and figure things out into this new life. So yeah, it was a bit more personal when I started to think about that, little reminiscent.
Wow. Yeah, and I see a lot of really nostalgic emotion coming from you as you go through that. Yeah.
Yet again, we do exercises very differently from one another.
Yes, this is true. This is true. So Leila, just continuing on this thread, and for everybody on the call, we've talked about what's changed in the last 10 years, but maybe we can talk about what's disappeared in the last 10 years.
That's interesting. Wow, I went further back than 10 years.
Okay.
All of a sudden, and this may date me, but I was thinking about VHS tapes and Betamax and 8-track recordings. So there's, and it's that technology again. How do we access music? How do we access movies? We don't have CDs and DVDs anymore. I mean, they exist, but is that our go-to? We've really shifted on how we access some of those things. So, yeah.
What came up for me was bell bottoms.
Okay. If you hold on, they might be back.
But I'm thinking about my mom, who is 90, and I used to love receiving letters from her, and I treasure those letters that she would send me, because she just wrote so beautifully. And now my mom has an iPad, and she's sending emails out. So many changes, and it really doesn't matter what age you're at. The world is changing, and we've got to change with it. And so often when I think about this, I think about, if we stand still, we fall behind.
Wow. Yeah, I think that's a great reflection on this, and an interesting way to take this activity a little bit further. So when we think about ourselves, what comes to mind is Jack Welch's quote. He was head of General Electric, and he said, if the rate of change on the outside is greater than the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And it's almost like change or die, and it's really speaking to, it sounds a bit ominous, but I think it really speaks to the fact that we have change going on the outside of us, and we must respond to that to adapt. And so when our ability to adapt is an internal choice and an internal action, but it really speaks to the fact that if we want to be relevant, if we want to exist in this new environment, we sometimes have to learn things and do things differently than perhaps we've done before. So it's an interesting kind of recognition of how we interact with change. The change is happening in the world around us. A lot of these changes, they're outside of our being many times. And in doing that, they're out of our hands. And yet what we have to do, our actions, will often have to be as responses. So it's kind of an interesting thing as to what's the driver for change. It might be on the outside, but our resilience has to be driven from the inside.
I love the segue, because I think that's where we go next, which is what happens to us? What is the internal psychological process we go through when we are hit by change? And, there's many models out there. Some of the more common ones are McKinsey and Edgar and Cotter. But the one that Leila and I chose to share with you is a model called the Kubler-Ross model. This model is really originally a model for the stages of grief, but you can use this model for personal change as well as for change in organizations. And so let's do a deep dive and talk a little bit more about this model, and then come out the other side.
Okay.
I want to share with you a change model to give you some language around the process we go through with change. This model was created by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross in the 1960s to describe the 5 stages of grief that one goes through when they lose a loved one. It is a classic model and it can be used really for any change we're going through. So let me walk you through each of the steps. Stage 1, denial. When we first experience change, we often go through shock and denial. This is when you're trying to process the change. You may not believe it is happening, and after that initial shock wears off, you may experience denial. Now, some people stay in denial for a very long time, and they may lose touch of reality and lose touch of what is actually their current reality. Stage 2, anger. Anger typically comes when the realization finally happens that this change is real. Now, during this phase, you may be angry at yourself or look for someone to blame. And this is when your emotions are all over the place and you express irritability, frustration, and just plain annoyance during this stage. Bargaining. When the stage of anger passes away, you may be in the bargaining stage. This is when you think of ways to postpone the inevitable and try to find the best thing left in the situation. Or this is where you may try to negotiate in the situation and come to a point of compromise. And bargaining may actually bring some temporary relief. Depression. Depression is when you may give up and feel like you have reached dead end. You may show signs of indifference. You may push people away. You have zero excitement towards anything in life. And this may seem like the lowest point in life where you see no way ahead. And some common signs of depression include sadness, low energy, and feeling really demotivated. Stage 5, acceptance. When people realize that fighting the change is not going to make the change go away, they come to a place of acceptance. And acceptance looks different for everyone. For some, it is to stop resisting the change and move forward with the new current reality. For others, acceptance is about exploring new opportunities and finding a way to thrive in the new circumstance. Now, let me give you a simple example to help you understand the model better. And this is the example of the dead car battery that some of you may have experienced. So imagine it's a chilly winter morning and it's dark outdoors. You have a job interview, you dash into your car, and as you place the key in the ignition and turn the car on, nothing happens. The battery is dead. Stage 1, shock and denial. Your first reaction is absolute shock and denial. This cannot be happening. The car was working perfectly well yesterday. You're already running late and you have an interview. You keep trying to start the car again and again and again, but nothing. The battery is dead. Stage 2, anger. Now that you realize the car cannot be started, you begin to feel angry and mad at the situation. Ah, you stupid car. I'm sick of you. Why is this happening today of all days? You slam, your hands against the steering wheel. Bargaining. Even though you know it probably won't help, you start asking the car to start just for once. Please, just start, just one more time. And I promise I will buy you a brand new battery as soon as possible. And I promise to keep you clean and tidy. Depression. All the negative thoughts start rushing to your mind. You begin to feel depressed, sad, and hopeless. You fear that you will not get to the interview on time. Like, what's the point? You might as well just give up. Stage 5, acceptance. You start to think, I need to do something. Let me try and figure this out. I will call an Uber to take me to the interview place. I will let the interview folks know that I will be 15 minutes late. And I will deal with the car situation when I come home in the evening. This is a simple example, But you can apply this change model to any change, like a sudden loss or a change of job, a change in relationship, a change in health. Now, a few things to remember about this model. When you go through change, there is always some form of loss you experience, even if it's a good change. Another thing to remember, the intensity and duration of the reaction depends on how significant you perceive the loss to be. If you do not perceive the loss to be significant, the intensity and your reaction through the change curve will be minimal. But if the loss is significant, it will take you much longer to go through the change cycle. So the dead battery situation could take 5 to 10 minutes to go from shock to acceptance. But a traumatic event or a big change like the loss of a parent or a diagnosis of cancer or losing your job or going through a divorce or moving to a new country will take longer. Another thing to remember, we do not move along the stages in a linear direction or step by step. If only life were that easy. We will move into stages in a random order and may sometimes even return back to a previous stage after a certain point in time. And each stage can actually last for a different time period. And sometimes a person gets stuck in a particular stage and is not able to move from there. What I love about this model, and I do love this model, is that it gives us language to think and talk about change, and it helps us understand where we are in our own change process. It also underlines the importance of moving forward toward acceptance, because acceptance is making space for the change to occur and finding peace. Now let's take a deeper dive into the Kubler-Ross model. So I know, Leila, that you absolutely love the Kubler-Ross model. It's your go-to model. What has been your experience with it?
Yeah. So as you said before, in your introduction to the model, this is a model that sometimes is used to mark the stages of grief, but I often use it in the context of change with organizations or with departments when I'm working as a consultant. And the reason being is, regardless of the change, positive or negative, often there is some experience of loss. And what I found was that, first of all, the car example, everyone can relate to. Everyone has a version of that experience that they can completely say, oh yes, I remember that roller coaster distinctly. And so it kind of is a great way to introduce this and almost give people permission to feel what they're feeling. And so inside of a team or an organization, what I find is that when we introduce this model of change, it gives people permission to say, it was okay that I wasn't happy about this change, or it was okay that I was very reluctant to embrace it. And they don't feel guilty about it, or they don't feel like they've betrayed their team for these feelings. So it validates some of the emotional component of going through change. The other thing that I loved about it was that it, like many of the models that we've talked about in this series, is it compartmentalizes some of the stages. So it's not this overwhelming sense of emotion, but rather these kind of milestone markers of the different stages where maybe we're experiencing slightly different emotions. So it also lets us unpack it a little bit. And when we're trying to understand something, it's helpful to break it down. And I think that's the beauty of models, is it just lets us, kind of dig in and really analyze it and then start to reflect on, well, how does that resonate with me? You.
For me, it's about the language. I love that I'm able to situate the language in this particular model because it's instinctive and it's classic and it makes sense. Let me pull up the model for a moment so we can all see it.
Yeah. I love the fact that it also resembles being on a roller coaster, because that's what change can sometimes feel like. So that curve is such a lovely curve to share.
Hmm. So I will walk you through my experience with change that I hope will bring some clarity around how this model works. So in 2012, I was diagnosed with one cancer and then a second cancer, both advanced cancers, one incurable. When I was diagnosed with that cancer, I was completely, absolutely in denial. I'd never been ill my entire life. I end up in the emergency ward. I'm surrounded by all these practitioners and specialists, and they want to do all kinds of tests and stuff. And I'm sitting here completely in denial. And my husband is completely in denial. And very quickly, I find out that I have these cancers, and I move into stage two, anger.
Mm.
Just before being diagnosed with cancer, I was being interviewed for an incredible role that I really wanted. And this role would have meant that I would travel to different parts of the world doing work that I loved doing. And I was a shoe in for that particular position. And we were just negotiating the last bit of stuff around me taking on this role when I got sick. So, as you can imagine, I didn't get the role and I was just really too sick to work. So, the anger was pretty heavy and stayed with me for a while. And then I actually did sink into depression. And depression was a very new feeling for me. It was not something that I know to experience or have experienced or have any experience with. And so the depression piece really took me by surprise. And I felt like I was in this abyss and I couldn't get out of it. And this is when I recognized all the losses. You know, you talked about loss, Leila. So there was the loss of identity. I didn't know who I was. I just felt like I was this burden on the system, you know. And this was probably the most difficult chapter that I wrote in my book. All the losses, you know, the loss of independence and the loss of finances and the loss of self esteem, you know. And I stayed in this depression for a bit until I slowly found my way out. And then there was the bargaining, and the bargaining was bargaining with my family on how I wanted to be treated because I felt like I was being treated like a cancer patient, and that didn't sit well for me. And I was bargaining with the doctors about how often I would go for treatment and what the treatment would look like. And then at some point, I got to acceptance,
Mm.
and that's when things opened up for me. I needed to go through that entire cycle to
Mm.
get to acceptance, because once I got to acceptance and radically accepted that I have this cancer, there is absolutely nothing I can do about it. And so I needed to figure out a different path.
Mm.
And that's where exploration occurred, and that's where possibilities took root and hope took root. And I discovered my purpose, and I started to do things that I was able to do that made my soul happy. And I wrote a book, and I, you know, wrote a blog, and I became an advocate for other people going through cancer. So I actually went through the cycle. The other thing I wanted to mention is about a month after I was diagnosed, or 2 months, I actually set my family down and took this model out, and I said, "Here's the change model. It's predictable, and so let's give it some language." And I asked everybody to identify where they were in the cycle. And it was fascinating, but you know, members of my family were in anger, in denial, in depression, and I seemed to be the one that was moving toward acceptance. But you know, it was such a good conversation because it gave us shared language. But more than that, you know, we talked about what we needed in terms of getting to acceptance, because we knew that until we go to acceptance, we could not make space for the change to occur. And so, at the beginning with the denial and anger, as you can see on the picture, what was required was information and communication. During the depression time, it was the emotional support, and then during the bargaining and acceptance, it was around guidance and forging that path and direction ahead.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that, one, for being so generous and vulnerable about your personal journey, Munira. It really provides a good, solid working example of how we go through the model. And I have to let you know, my family doesn't let me do that. If I pull out a PowerPoint, they usually leave the room. So good on your family for staying with it. But a couple of things came up, and as you were talking about this, I think that, though this session is never a substitute for any sort of professional work in mental health, I love the fact that this model and even your conversations and your advocacy work has created permission for people to talk about mental health. Because I think that sometimes when we look at this, people haven't necessarily looked at that depression area and felt like that was an okay place to admit to being. So I really appreciate that you did that. The second piece that sort of, as you were going through the example, I was looking at the model saying there is no direct access from shock and denial to acceptance, because, us overachievers, we just want to get there as fast as possible. And there is no direct route there. And so sometimes we also have to accept that this process must play its part. And if we try to get to acceptance by pretending we've accepted, we'll just have to go through and do the route again anyways. So I thought that was kind of interesting. And I also sort of, as you were talking about that, sort of the darkest part of this journey, you probably couldn't have imagined at that time that this was going to be the springboard into reigniting your purpose, being this advocate, doing the kind of work that you've been doing over the past few years. And if you think about it, your last 10 years have been about this, but first you had to do this journey. And then you got reconnected to your purpose. So that acceptance was this. But if you had asked Munira in that sort of darkest area, you're going to be writing a book, you're going to be doing a blog, I'm pretty sure I know what your answer would have been. And it would have been, go away, Leila. I don't really want to talk
Because at
about
that
this.
time, all you're trying to do is survive.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
yet, when you were saying what you just did, it occurred to me that this is a really hopeful model.
It
It
is.
really is a hopeful model. If you go through the stages, and you do need to go through the stages, even those of you who are overachievers on the call, because if you don't, it will come back to bite you.
Mm-hmm,
You need to make peace with
mm-hmm,
the model, and then come to that place of acceptance. And I also wanted to say that sometimes I find, even today, even knowing this model and working it, is sometimes, when the third cancer diagnosis came, I went right back. I went right back, because I needed to go through that. But the difference this time, and that's really where I want to take us next. The difference this time is that you build that resilience muscle. And so all of a sudden, what happens is the amount of time that it would have taken me to go from denial to acceptance, might have been 6 months in the first go around. But when I needed to do it again, I was able to get through that curve, and I was able to do it within a month or two,
wow.
you know? And so that's sort of the link between change and resilience. How do you take change, and then how do you figure out a way to shorten the time and shorten the pain, essentially?
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, and this is probably an experience that many of you on the webinar today can attest to, that some people sit in depression or in anger or in denial you know, for a long time without really giving themselves a fighting chance to see what might be past that. And so, this is something for you to reflect on. Are there situations in your life that would serve you accepting that situation versus sitting in denial, for instance? Does that make sense, Leila?
It does. And, I'm so glad that this isn't about getting rid of this process, but rather understanding it and accepting that going through it is there. We will have to accept those stages. However, the reflection, the self-discovery is, have I been hanging around this particular stage for too long? And am I done with it? Because if you're done with it, you're ready to move on. However, you've got to give yourself that space and ability to do that. And I think what we'll be talking about in building resilience, and thank you for sharing that sort of tightening up of the model, because really when we look at the title of this, it's about bouncing back. We want to look for those strategies that say, how do we bounce back? We don't have control over many of the things that are happening to us. But what we can do is control our ability to bounce back and strengthen that as much as possible. So not to get rid of it, but just to understand it and say, okay, I'm gonna be okay with when it's dark. I'm gonna be okay that in the fullness of time, this will move on and there's hope. And I really love that message inside of how we approach this model.
Hmm. So this may actually be a great time to talk about resilience, and I know that there's many models of resilience out there as well, and this is the one that we selected to share with you because it fits so nicely with the Kubler-Ross cycle.
All right. So this model is called the General Adaptation Syndrome. It was developed by Hans Selye, and it is often used within the context of managing stress or understanding our stress response. So it's got three segments that we go through, and the sort of horizontal line in the middle is your regular ability to manage stress. Knowing who we are and how we're being as human beings, when we have a stressor occur and it impacts us, we go through a certain number of stages. And so the first stage is called the alarm stage. And you'll notice that the line goes across normally, the stressor occurs, and all of a sudden there's a dip in the response. And I like to call that the deer in headlights moment. So, it might be the shock that happens in the Kubler-Ross model, but it's just really, this can't possibly be happening. And so what happens is that we are taking in all this new information that suddenly throws us off kilter. A really good example of that would be maybe crossing the street. If you were crossing the street and you didn't do what your parents asked you to do or taught you to do, which is look both ways, and you just cross the street, and suddenly in your peripheral vision, you see a car coming at you, there will be this moment where you freeze and you're taking in all that information. And rather than run across the street, you're freezing and you're staring at this car coming at you. Fortunately, nature built us to survive. Nature built us to be resilient. So what happens is we very quickly move into the second stage called resistance. And we can call that resilience, because this is really our ability to adapt and say, when stuff is happening on the outside, we need to sometimes dig deep and find the stuff on the inside. So what'll happen when you're in the street is you won't freeze forever. Your body says you need to move. And suddenly, even if you were slugging along, schlepping through the day, suddenly you move like you're a Usain Bolt. Like you make it across the street like a, Olympic athlete. And you've been able to do that because your body kicked in and drew from a well that says, when you experience a stressor, you can dig deep and we can give you the adrenaline. We can give you all of those, sort of chemical reactions that allow you to resist and respond to the stressor that you're experiencing. That stressor isn't necessarily always a physical one. It could be a mental one. So this could be you're plugging along in your day at work, and all of a sudden somebody says, hey, did you get the report done for this afternoon's meeting? Two questions go into your head. What report and what meeting? That's your deer in headlights moment. And then suddenly you're like, okay, get the report done and find out when that meeting is. And so suddenly you start operating at a much higher level. I like to think about the resistance stage or the resilience stage as almost like an elastic band. So when we start to think about the elastic band, when we experience stress, we tighten the elastic band to say, okay, draw from the well and give what energy you need to. And then when you get across the street and you exhale, or you get into the meeting and you're distributing the report, you exhale. The elastic band relaxes and we go back to normal resistance. Even something like hunger can be a stressor, because hunger is tightening up that elastic band, and we need to deal with that we're putting a stress on our body when we're not feeding it. And so what happens is when we feed it, the elastic band relaxes. So that's kind of the process that we want to go through. So what's this third stage? This third stage says we have this ongoing tightening and loosening of an elastic band. However, let's imagine if with the car, rather than running across the street, you started running down the street with the car behind you. At some point, you're not going to make it, right? Because that car is going to be much stronger and much more durable. It's got much more endurance than a person does. And so when we start to see exhaustion, what we see is the band is so tight. And that might be when the stressor is so great or is so prolonged that we just can't take it anymore and the elastic band snaps. And so what we want to see is that we understand this process so that we don't get to the exhaustion stage, that we are doing a number of different things to keep that elastic band resilient, to keep ourselves well. Because when we think about what happens for us in the resilience or resistance stage, is we're drawing from our internal sort of sources of energy, and that's not something that's going to be there forever. And so we have to recognize that there's a limit on that. And if we draw from it too much, we start to see things like job burnout. We start to see people leave professions where they've studied for years, but they just did not manage that stress level. We see people just kind of completely check out from a relationship or something, you know, because that exhaustion has set in and there's just no bounce back. And so we really wanted to sort of look at that. There's 5 ways to get to the resilience, but maybe I'll stop here and just, are there thoughts that you have, Munira?
Yeah, I do love this model as well. And I think the things that are coming up for me are, one, with the stressor, it's about knowing what your stressors are. It's about knowing them, knowing your body, knowing, you know, what are things that are going to get you off kilter. With phase 2, it's really around doing the work there and not letting it slide and slide and slide. Because once you get to that phase 3, the exhaustion phase, it's really hard to come back. Not impossible, but really hard. Yeah. So the idea is, and I think sometimes, unfortunately, I know that I'm certainly guilty of this, as many of you probably are, is we take that elastic and we go as far as we can, and we test it more and more. But the idea is, you know, why do this to ourselves, right? If you're able to work through this in phase 2 without getting to that breakdown point, we are much more easily able to bounce back.
Right. What a great tie into self-awareness. Because
Yes.
when we know ourselves, we also know those things that cause stress for us. And also the fact that we might be different from one another in terms of how we respond to stress. So when you started to talk about those individual differences, one person may be experiencing stress and perceiving it very differently than another. So, you know, one person might say, oh, well, okay, there's a meeting this afternoon. Okay, I'll get the report. And worst case, I'll just apologize and say I forgot. whereas another person would say, that's not even in my realm of possibility. I wouldn't have even thought to apologize, because they perceive that situation differently from one another. So I think that that's quite an interesting prospect to start to consider how we might look at this. And it also speaks to the fact that we can learn some different things. And I think about paramedic training. So emergency services training often talks about narrowing the alarm stage as much as possible. Because if you think about first responders, they can't stay deer in headlights for long. The last thing you want to have someone do at an accident scene is go, wow, this looks really bad. Like you need first responders to respond, and that's stage 2. And so a lot of their training will be around moving into the action. And so when we start to think about that, that's what we're learning. And when we start to look at some of those bounce back activities and bounce back strategies, what we're doing is we're saying, we're going to have these moments. However, now let's talk about, what are some of our strategies that say we want to take care of the elastic band. We might need to take care of what's in the well, but overall, we're taking care of ourselves. And so if we can look at some of those strategies, we've got kind of 5 big categories that often come with the Cellier model. One of them is sort of withdrawing from the stressor, and that really means either temporary or permanently taking that stressor away from you. And so sometimes when people make decisions about changing their jobs, that might be a withdrawal from the stressor, or taking a break each day, sort of saying, I'm going to make sure that I don't sit in front of the computer for 8 hours. I'm going to make sure that I just, take those breaks every couple of hours, just even to get a breath of fresh air, or to stretch and change up what's happening to my body. Removing the stressor might be saying we just want to take away that stressor. And so I think about my children's daycare, and when the kids were young, the stressor for us was the fact that we both worked in different locations and our children were in a third location. And it was always a worry for us, because if we got a phone call that the kids needed us, it was a long commute to get there. And so one of the removals of stressors was that my husband's workplace had an on-site preschool, and we were able to enroll the children there. And that allowed us to remove the stressor of we're not near our kids. The changing stress perception is now going back to our session on perception that we did in week 2 of our series. And it was, how are you looking at stress? And so the quote that we talked about last week was the Wayne Dyer quote: when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. So imagine shifting your viewpoint to say, this matters right now, but will this matter in 10 months? Will this matter in 10 years? And so how you look at a situation might give you a neutral, objective view of a stressor and change how it's impacting you. Changing the stress consequences was a big one that I think, actually both of those, the previous one, stress perception as well as stress consequences, I think are a big part of who you were and how you managed your journey through cancer, Munira, because I think about your acceptance and your choosing hope. And it was you looking at this to say, this impacted me, and this has taught me something, and this is something that I now have to share and support others with. And so you changed your perception around the purpose of that journey. But you also did a really good job of self-care, because what you did was you were changing your stress consequences. And that relates to the filling of the well. So when we think about that, we're saying, you were saying to yourself, I need to keep the body that is going to be exposed to this cancer, that's being exposed to the chemo and all the other treatments that you had to endure. Each one of those was a stressor on you. And you said, I have to keep this body as well as possible, because I'm not in a fight, I'm in a battle. And so I've got to really take care of myself. And of course, the last one is social support. And when we think about that, that's our ability to support one another through our connections with others. talking to one another. And again, I would say that's a big part of who you've been to others in your work after your cancer, and the work subsequently through your own journey, and supporting others. And so when we start to think about that, these are the things that kind of build ourselves up and create the resilience. And so those are just some examples of the kinds of things that would go into those 5 categories. Munira?
When we talk about emotions later in the series, we will be spending quite a bit of time talking about more ways to be resilient. But for this particular one, we wanted to introduce something to you that you might not have seen before. So again, 5 stressors: withdraw from the stressor, remove the stressor, change the stress perception, change the stress consequences, and social support, the importance of social support. Where I think we go next is, we've talked a lot and we've given you a lot of information, but we want to put you through an activity so that you get a chance to actually work through the general adaptation syndrome as well as the Kubler-Ross model. And so let me share what the activity is, and I'm hoping that you will all engage in this fully. So this is what the model looks like. And again, if you've got a copy of this that you were able to download, you can use that as you go through this activity. What it is I want you to really think about your personal response to COVID-19, your personal response to the pandemic, because it has been a pretty big deal for all of us, an unprecedented time. And I can tell you that every person has probably managed the pandemic in their own personal ways. So we want to give you an opportunity to do that in this activity. So what stage are you at of the cycle, from the ones that, from the cycle that you see here? And where might you be stuck at? And what do you need to get to that place of acceptance? So take a few minutes and we will do this activity with you as well. And let's start there. And then there's a second part to the activity.
Okay. And I wanted to share, as folks are starting to do this work, I've heard that there's viewers that watch this together. And so they've been doing the activities together as a group. And I think that's one, getting a jump start on your homework. But it's also another interesting way, one, to get social support, but also to share the journey with one another. And so if you haven't thought of doing that, that's another way to, sort of connect with one another as you're going through each of the activities.
That's a great idea.
We did that with our team and found that it was quite fun to do with one of the recordings. And I'm sure many of you with children at home, having to now think about school age families, or families with school age children, you've had to, add into that that you became a teacher, or that you had to now look at some of the challenges that the pandemic introduced to your family. And so lots of different kinds of stressors. So it'll be interesting to see how this exercise pans out for each of you.
Right. And that was actually the second part of the activity. So the first was really to figure out, what stage you were at and how do you know, and what stage other people in your household may be, because it'll be interesting conversation if you're on different stages. But the other piece then is around, of the 5 resilience strategies, what are those strategies that you are using in this cycle? So again, maybe that is an activity you can just continue to complete and fine tune after the session today. So I'm thinking this was a lot of content. We know. We hope you found it valuable. Our goal was just to give you some shared language for you to think about how you deal with change and how you can be more resilient. This may be a good time to go to the 315 practice activity.
Absolutely. So, as you know, 315 means that you're going to choose three people in your life, people that you trust, and you're going to spend 15 minutes with them. They can be the same people that you've gone to if you've done the earlier sessions. And with them this time, what we'd like you to do is share the two models, the Kubler-Ross model and the Selye model, and talk a little bit about your experience. You can use the pandemic example as the deeper dive, or an example that came up as we were sharing the models to begin with. So what we want you to do is talk a little bit about what you discovered about yourself, and then think about the strategies that you've used, your resilience strategies. What are the 5 categories? And are there any categories that you've maybe skipped over? It'll be interesting to now open up the Johari window and have the individuals share with you, provide you some feedback on your resilience, what they've seen in you, and maybe share some of their examples of how they have been resilient in the past as well. So really want you to sort of take these models and let them be a springboard for a conversation with each of these 3 people. And hopefully it'll deepen your understanding of kind of where you're at and how you've gone through these, with the intention of saying, when you've got this resilience strengthened, it's going to let you go back to living your values. And I think that's the feedback that you want to get. If these are the individuals who had the values conversations with you, talk to them about the connection there. What can I do when I'm facing stress that allows me to then get reconnected with my values? Because I sometimes feel I lose my way. And I think that'll be a really good exercise. 15 minutes, 3 people, 45 minutes, you'll be done, but it'll be worth the work.
And we'd like to end today's session with our favorite quotes, as always. And is there one that you'd like to share, Leila?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm going to, there's a quote from C. Joybell C. And the quote is, "We can't be afraid of change. We may feel very secure in the pond, or you may feel very secure in the pond that you're in. But if you never venture out of it, you'll never know that there's such a thing as a sea or an ocean. Holding on to something that is good for you now may be the very reason why you don't have something better."
So venture out of the pond.
Yeah, be brave. And we've asked people to be courageous. And so be courageous in your resilience.
My quote is from none other than Nelson Mandela. And he says, "Do not judge me by my success. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again."
Mm,
And that, I think, is the true definition of resilience.
yes, absolutely.
So, with that, thank you again for being on this learning journey with us, as we learn from you and you learn from us and we learn from each other. And as you're going through your practice activities, if you find that you have questions, you want to share your successes, you want to share your challenges, when you get the feedback form for today's session, just indicate that you want to share that information and provide your email address, and we will connect back with you just to give you that little bit more that you might need. So thank you again so much. Next session is a really, really great session. It's about looking at your life like it is a pizza. And maybe I'll just leave it at that. So thanks again so much. And we look forward to seeing you again next week.
Thank you, Munira. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you, Leila.